Hi everyone, my name's Teresa and my topic is inner city poverty and its relation to trauma and violence. So the causes of inner city poverty are complex, and depending on which disciplines' lens you look through is going to determine what exactly your view is. So to economists, it's an issue of labor markets, productivity, incentives, human capital, and choice. Sociologists and anthropologists tend to emphasize the social status, relations, behavior, and culture. For social psychologists, the issues may include self-image, group membership, and attitudes. For political scientists, the questions may focus on group power and access to collective resources. And for city planners and urbanists, they see the effects of urban structure, isolation, and transportation access. For us, as Dr. Penning's students, it is a form of complex trauma that exhibits characteristics and effects discussed in adverse childhood experiences, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and attachment theory. So, I want to start off by sharing my initial thoughts regarding poverty. So I created this word cloud. Some of the words I think of or thought of initially when I would think about poverty was uneducated, jail, crime, poor, drugs, gangs, violence, dangerous. You get the point. The reason I created this word cloud was because I wanted to show my initial thoughts, and I think the initial thoughts of a lot of other people who are uneducated about this topic. For me, this isn't something I relate to. It's actually something I don't have a lot of knowledge on, or I didn't have a lot of knowledge on before this project, and that's actually why I chose it. I think poverty is often overlooked as a traumatic experience and is not always regarded as a reason for someone's behaviors that actually may result from living in poverty. I think often people who don't live in poverty, like myself, are just kind of told to turn a blind eye because it's not safe to go to these places, and it's not my concern. Unfortunately, growing up in New York, there are a lot of inner city impoverished places, and I was always told just to not go there. Don't go there. Avoid it. Don't worry about it type of thing. It just wasn't something I was supposed to concern myself with. And for that reason, I don't have a lot of knowledge about them, I think. And I think as a result of the rules, I guess, that I was told was not the reason, but rather the result of those rules just kind of led me to think that people who were poor were just poor because there was a lack of effort to not be poor. And of course, I know now that's a very ignorant thought, but that's why I chose this topic, because I wanted something that was going to get me thinking. So, what's missing from my word cloud? A lot of things. Some things include the words complex trauma or chronic stress, because poverty provokes that in adults, and that can get carried over quickly and easily into the children for they're being impacted during their formative years. Poverty can generate a lot of adverse childhood experiences. It may prevent individuals from attending to their higher up needs, as mentioned in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It can cause interpersonal attachment issues. It influences an individual's cognition and intuition, and it can lead to a lack of resources. So, again, poverty is a form of complex trauma, and we're just going to talk more about why that is. Before we can do that, I like to touch upon the characteristics of complex trauma. The characteristics of complex trauma include repeated interpersonal trauma over a long period of time. I think it's obvious that poverty isn't really just one single event. It's a series of events. It's an environment in which an individual lives. In addition, another characteristic of complex trauma is a feeling of an inability to escape, which I think a lot of individuals living in poverty feel. There's a disconnection and difficulty with forming and maintaining relationships. And again, these are all things that we see in these families and communities that live in poverty. Complex trauma can also lead to self-harming or destructive behaviors. No one is immune. Everyone has a breaking point. Again, like, although humans are such a resilient species, and maybe some families in these poverty struck areas do well, there's still a breaking point for them as well. And if experienced as a child, this can have complex trauma, and specifically the poverty that leads to complex trauma may have significant impacts on how these children develop. So, poverty stressors on adults is the first thing I'm really going to dive into. Although most of my research I found ended up being tailored more towards children, I think it's essential to discuss the poverty stressors on adults, because adults are the other piece of these communities and these households. So some stressors include worrying about hunger or being economically strained. These kinds of stressors lead to chronic stress, which can lead to physical and mental health issues such as anxiety or depression. A lot of times when feeling this way, adults may turn to drugs or alcohol to relieve this stress or to detach themselves from their situations. I'm just going to move myself up here for a moment. In addition, these adults are concerned about the violence for themselves and for their families. They may even turn to violent behaviors themselves because of their feelings of overwhelm or hopelessness. They're unable to bring their children safely to school. If they have a job, they're likely working long hours, and this can lead to a lack of stability and routine. So their lives are chaotic and disorganized, and this can often lead them to neglect their children, and it can have serious emotional, mental, physical effects on the children. And the adults may even choose to engage in criminal acts, and unfortunately, sometimes that is just out of desperation. And so these stressors can all significantly influence the adults, and this then gets carried on into the children. So some poverty stressors on children include that it is their formative years. So children do not yet know how to handle situations, regulate their emotions. They have no sense of self or autonomy. It's very fragile years. In addition, they're exposed to the violence and the crimes and gangs and drugs and maltreatment. And when they're in these sensitive, fragile years, being exposed to such unfortunate events can significantly influence the way these children think, cope, and even what they consider their future to be. Their parents may neglect them, and this can be for a variety of reasons. I know I've previously mentioned just because the parents are working, and they're working so much that they're unable to really support their children. And unfortunately, children are dependent on their parents emotionally and financially, and this can become a stressor if the parents are unable to fulfill their emotional or financial needs. Again, this lack of stability in a daily routine doesn't only affect the adults, it actually affects the children as well. And they often go to school with children in similar situations and communities, so not only is this in their own household, but it's around them everywhere these children go, and this can lead to these feelings of hopelessness because it's all that they see, and they really do feel like there's no way out and there's an inability to escape. So with that, I want to start honing in on some of the theories that we've talked about in class. The first one being adverse childhood experiences. So if we look at that bottom tier, it literally just says ACE, and what an ACE is, or what they are stressful traumatic events. This can include abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, substance abuse within the household, and household mental illness. I found it interesting how many of these ACEs actually include the entire household, and that is, again, why it's important to look at how poverty affects parents and adults and other adults as well as the children, because this isn't really, although they are childhood experiences, they are influenced by the adults as well. So moving on, I'm going to work up into that next tier of social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. The reactions to these traumatic events are sometimes misdiagnosed, unfortunately, as ADHD. Kids dealing with adverse experiences may act impulsively. They may act out with anger or other strong emotions, and these are behaviors that would also align with ADHD. And unfortunately, the person who is diagnosing the child may be unaware of the experiences that this child goes through at home, or maybe just unaware of the depth of these experiences, and that could lead to a misdiagnosis. In addition, these children are being raised in an environment that doesn't teach them techniques to properly regulate emotions. And again, as I had said previously, it is their formative years, and it is when children are learning how to regulate their emotions. So if a child is feeling anxious, depressed, lonely, whether that be a result of their household or maybe a situation at school, whatever the case may be, a child is going to act impulsively, and they're not going to properly read social cues because they are not learning how to regulate their emotions. There may be an increased monitoring of their environment because they don't feel safe and secure. They may have an increased need for affection or reassurance. Maybe they're not getting that from their caregiver, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But all of these feelings and situations can lead these children to not properly develop. And again, this is a result of the household and the adult. And unfortunately, if their parents went through similar experiences, they're not going to know how to teach their kids because it's likely the parents themselves don't know. So now we're going to move up into that adoption of health risk behaviors. Again, this is a result of the adverse childhood experiences, and health risk behaviors can include drug and alcohol abuse as it becomes a coping mechanism for these children. It is a method of detachment from their situation, and these behaviors often carry into adulthood. A lot of times, too, these children see their parents dealing with their problems this way, and that's where they can maybe learn it from. Moving up a little higher, this can lead to disease, disability, and social problems. As I had said previously, children aren't reading social cues. They're not learning how to properly develop, and living in the poverty leads to an inability or a lack of desire to access resources to combat these issues. And again, that is why you have mental illness and these social problems and disease, and all of this added up, unfortunately, as studies show, can lead to an early death. So now I want to talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because in a poverty-ridden environment, and in any environment, there are several levels of needs. However, in a poverty-ridden environment, these needs are not necessarily being met. And I know that in class we have learned that there are some discrepancies in this theory, and that it's not necessarily such a rigid order. However, I think it's still important to acknowledge the struggles that poverty can lead to on these different levels. So with that said, I'm going to start with the physiological needs, which include literally like food and water, shelter, clothing, sleep, so on. Financial struggles can often lead to uncertainty of what a family's next meal will be, or it can result in a lack of clothing or stable shelter. In one of the articles that I was reading for this project, it talked about stable shelter and how a lot of these neighborhoods or these homes have rat infestation issues or flooding problems, and unfortunately, like, it's just so unsanitary, and it really, although there's a roof over their head and maybe they have a bed, it's still not considered a stable or healthy environment for these children. And so poverty and the financial struggles that generally come with poverty can lead to physiological needs not being met. I want to walk on over into the safety needs, and a quote that I had found in one of in a part of my research was, it said, feeling safe and secure is a prerequisite for healthy emotional development and general welfare. And although this quote is not necessarily saying that you can't fulfill love and belonging needs until you fulfill safety needs, it is saying that safety needs are necessary for healthy emotional development. And again, in these violent, unsafe neighborhoods, children aren't feeling safe and secure. And as I had discussed earlier, there was an issue with parents feeling like they are unable to get their kids safely to school. So yeah, there's violence, unemployment problems, poor healthcare, children are not guaranteed they can get to school safely, etc. These are all ways in which safety needs may not be being met. Moving on to love and belonging, that can really mean friendship and intimacy. It can mean family. It can just mean a sense of connection with individuals around you. So children in poverty, anyone in poverty, is likely feeling a lack of family or sense of connection. That might be because of their parents' internal struggles that make them incapable of connecting with their children, or because there's just neglect, whether the parents just chose to leave or, again, they work too much. And in addition, as we've already discussed, like there are poor social skills amongst these individuals, and that also makes maintaining friendships or intimacy difficult. Now we can go on over into the esteem needs. So poverty can lead to challenges with an individual's esteem as they maintain a low social status in society. In addition, it can be difficult to find the right way of confronting these injustices of life. One may not feel free, but rather trapped. And again, like, just going back to what we've been talking about, there's just a lack of like self-respect as they choose a lot of times these risky behaviors, and this lower status in society can really like impact an individual, and they don't feel free. They feel stuck. They feel like there's no way out of this. And again, that leads them to not ever reach or like just face this self-actualization, this desire to become the most that you can be, because these depressing, demotivating environments lead individuals to not ever feel this way. Even if they don't have their safety needs met, they're not ever going to feel like they're the most that they can be. So to transition into, sorry, I'm going to move this over. To transition into the attachment theory, I found this quote that I think kind of really resonated well with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as well as the attachment theory. So it's a quote from someone who grew up in a poverty-ridden area, and it says, "I grew up as looking for somebody to love me in the streets. You know, my mother was always working. My father used to be doing his thing, and so I was by myself. I'm here looking for some love. I ain't got nobody to give me love, so I went to the streets to find love." So this quote to me just speaks volumes about what I've been reading about and writing about, because it talks about how this person clearly felt neglected because the mother was always working and the father was doing his thing. So he was alone. So he felt neglected and he didn't feel loved. He didn't feel that love and belonging or that security. And he went to the streets to find this. And I immediately thought of Nig from Once Were Once Warriors. Because he joined that gang when his parents just like weren't being supportive of him and were too busy drinking and partying with their friends to care about him. And so I just thought this quote spoke volumes about this topic and just showed like the truth about like why people maybe end up in situations such as gang violence or committing crimes or just not being connected to their own families. And those are common aspects of a poverty-ridden neighborhood. So now we're going to talk about the attachment theory. Just as a reminder, attachment is an affectionate bond between two individuals, and it joins them emotionally. It also lays a good foundation for being able to form other secure relationships. Mothers or caregivers are primarily responsible for establishing that sense of security and connection in infants. And ideally, secure attachment is when a child generally feels secure, explorative, and happy. It's a result of a mother's responsiveness being quick, sensitive, consistent, and the child believes that their needs will be met. Unfortunately, we see a lot of times in these poverty-ridden families that this isn't necessarily the case. And so we're going to talk about some attachment theories that and how they're seen more in a in an impoverished family. Move this over here. So in a poverty-ridden family, a caregiver's responsiveness to a child's signals and needs may be hindered. A caregiver may have a distant, inconsistent, neglectful, or erratic responses to a child. This may lead a child to believe that their needs will not be met. They may feel confused, anxious, insecure, or angry. And it can stem from a multitude of circumstances. So what I did, if you look to the right, was I actually took pieces of a chart from one of our class PowerPoints talking about the different attachment theories. And I added a column of ways that like we would see these attachment theories in play, these attachment styles in play in an impoverished family. So if we look at avoidant attachment, it says, as a child, the caregiver may have dealt with ACEs themselves. This could inhibit their ability to properly care for someone else since they're struggling with an inability to properly connect. This would lead a mother to be distant and disengaged with their child, and this could lead a child to be emotionally distant themselves or believe that their needs won't be met. Ambivalent attachment. Families in poverty often have a less stable, consistent structure, and this too can lead to unstable and inconsistent treatment towards a child. Mother's responsiveness may sometimes be sensitive, sometimes be neglectful, and a child can feel anxious or insecure, angry, and cannot rely on his or her needs being met. Again, I felt like this really related to Nig in that movie because he and all the children, honestly, because they had this very inconsistent relationship with their mother where sometimes she cared for them and sometimes she just wasn't able to. And then we have disorganized attachment. Many adults in poverty struggle with drugs or alcohol abuse. In addition, there's a lack of safety in a household and a community. All these stressors and several others can lead adults to be depressed or angry and incapable of gently responding to a child's needs. Again, a mother or a caregiver's responsiveness may be extreme, frightening, passive, or intrusive, and a child will be depressed, angry. They're going to be very confused and not really sure how their needs are going to be met. So again, this is from one of our class slideshows as well, and it's just talking about how this, how a good attachment versus a poor attachment can affect a child's view of themselves as well as the world. So if a child's feeling safe, they're going to feel like the world is safe. If they can trust adults and they feel valued, they're going to feel like there's a place for them here in the world. Whereas if they have this poor attachment and they feel unsafe or not valued, they're going to feel like there's no place for them. They're going to feel like the world is a dangerous place, and they're going to feel unlovable. And they're going to feel like no one in the world can love them. So the way I want to wrap this up is just, again, really going back to poverty. And I think anyone can conclude that living in poverty means a lack of money. I think where we go wrong, including myself, especially before this project, was not everyone considers the depth of that burden. So these families are unable to afford and or access the resources that they need in order to overcome this adversity. These poverty-ridden areas prompt an isolated location, meaning that the individuals living in poverty are not just one run-down house, but rather they're in a community with others in this same difficult situation. There's a lack of transportation, and a lot of times that is due to this lack of money, these financial restrictions, where some people may not own a car or may not be able to afford gas for it. And this, again, can lead to this isolated location. It's difficult for people just to leave to go to work. And the limited places of employment in the actual community can also refer back to this isolated location, making it difficult for these individuals to escape. Continuing on, so these poverty-ridden areas prompt no safe or good schools, meaning children aren't getting degrees, unfortunately, and more importantly, they're failing to be educated about the effects that their living circumstances have on them. So they're unaware of these developmental problems. They just have these problems, and they're surrounded by people with these same problems, and this lack of knowledge leads to an inability to escape this vicious cycle of living in poverty. There's also a lot of depression and violence and masses of individuals feeling this inability with them. I found this great quote when I was doing my research saying that these residents are likely to have contact with other people with limited resources. So someone may be having a struggle, whether that be mentally, physically, emotionally. It could be alcohol abuse or drug abuse or anxiety, whatever it is. And they want to phone a friend. That friend that they're phoning likely has limited resources as well and can't necessarily refer them to the right kind of place for help. And again, there's no therapy for these people, whether that is for drug abuse or violence or communication or family problems, marital problems, domestic violence problems. That even if these families did have the finances to be able to afford this therapy, there's not really places for these services in these communities because the majority of the people there can't afford them. And unfortunately, all of these structural barriers that my group is discussing, as well as as well as what I'm touching upon, they really prevent communities from breaking this cycle of poverty. It's very difficult for them to get out, and it really comes down to, I think, a lack of resources, and that's why there's just this continued cycle, and these problems are passed on through generations. So yeah, and then these are my references. Thank you.